Now let's turn to a different perspective. I would even say a different, not continent, because we also had colleagues already from Canada. It's my great pleasure to welcome you, Jean-Noé from Open North and Canada, to share some views. We, I think, have many similarities between what you're presenting and what we've heard already here. I was going to say through the day, for you maybe through the night or through the morning. But it's so great that we can move, you know, continent by continent and see these perspectives. So I give you the floor. You have some time to elaborate, and we will have a conversation. Our colleague Dava will also join, and hopefully we can have an inspiring talk reflecting on current events and future outlook. So please introduce yourself, and thanks again for coming.
My great pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I've been following some of the talks that have been kind of given over the day as well. And it's a great opportunity because I think, you know, a lot of the topics that we're all kind of wrestling with or addressing on a local scale, you know, obviously have implications on a global scale, and we just can't go around that. And so, you know, as the executive director of Open North, there's a lot of work that we've done, you know, initially starting from the open data space. But as ED, I think the presentation that I'm going to give you today is going to, you know, chart out some of the key trends and how we've positioned ourselves around some critical issues related to data and technology as it applies to cities and different size of communities. So I'll share with you my screen, and then we'll get started here and look forward, obviously, to the conversation afterwards. Okay, fantastic. So I'll be speaking about open smart communities from a Canadian perspective, as well as some of the approaches that are emerging. And in the Canadian context, as I said, I think you'll see how it impacts communities around the world. So it's important to start from a values kind of basis. A lot of the work that we do obviously is informed by our vision and the mission of the organization, but I think this will also resonate with some critical issues related to data and technology. So at Open North, as the Canadian not-for-profit organization that specializes in data and technology for communities, you'll see that there's a very kind of strong focus on responsible use of technology and data. And really, as a not-for-profit organization, being able to put ourselves on the side of communities and helping them making better decisions, whether it's from a data governance perspective or technology procurement and whatnot. And the inclusion aspect is obviously very critical when we talk about designing kind of the cities of the future. Some key trends here that I'm going to be focusing on during the presentation, after I give a bit of more context from the Canadian kind of situation. Opening up tech procurement, prioritizing data governance, entrenching digital rights, and how to activate principles into mechanisms as well. And I'll speak to some examples from the Canadian context here, as well as some international ones. So maybe let's start with, you know, maybe the elephant in the room, so to speak, especially here in Canada. The experience and the learnings from the Keysight project, often referred to as the kind of Sidewalk Labs project. So from the City of Toronto, I'm not going to go into like the whole kind of background, but basically sister company of Google, Alphabet, that competed or that was provided the opportunity to compete and put forward a very kind of ambitious proposal on land development that's highly valued in the Toronto context, the biggest city in Canada. It was met with a lot of pushback by local kind of community activists, and in a very kind of interesting way from a cross section of different types of communities that really wanted to counter a let's call it a techno you know, optimist kind of like vision, without taking into account a lot of different kind of issues related to digital culture, stakeholder relationships in the design process itself. In the Keysight project development, it was the the company that was actually leading the consultation process that would then inform the development of that proposal. So there's issues that were raised by the advisory panel around, potential conflicts of interest there, and raised some really critical issues around, who gets to be involved in the development of large scale, technology kind of focused, smart city focused projects. Issues around data localization, obviously, were a big concern, as well as, not becoming a bit of a guinea pig, for testing kind of scalable solutions. Why should a community in Canada become a testing ground for a major corporation in the world? What's in it for us, at the end of the day? And then having more access to information related to the proposal itself, the costing, and the real nature of the ambitions and the interests of the corporate player that was putting forward that ambitious vision. And we know that there's a lot of learnings that came out from that we have been able to apply in other contexts. So in a way, I could say that I'm grateful for the Keysight project because it enabled us to bring to light a lot of issues that were kind of dormant a little bit in the Canadian context that also apply, I think, more broadly internationally, in particular around data governance. And of course, in Canada, we don't have GDPR, for example, so we don't have that to fall back to, as a measure to ensure digital privacy rights, for example. So all those issues were brought to light in that context, which, to turn this into an opportunity, there's a lot of ways that we've been able to learn from it. In the Canadian context, I think one of the key things here, and I know that, challenges are very kind of common as a mechanism to incentivize communities to think in an innovative way around, how and what they can do with data and how they can engage local stakeholders in the development of a smart city. We had a key role in the development of the Government of Canada's Smart Cities Challenge. And in fact, when you look at the criteria to be able to apply, openness was one of the key kind of factors there. So that's great because then we're seeing how there's institutionalized kind of normalization of some key critical principles that then guide and create parameters by which people are speaking about the opportunities related to technology and data as it impacts smart cities. So from the involvement of the Government of Canada, I think there's an emerging Canadian model of a smart community, whereby you've had upwards of 170 different communities that competed for this challenge, 5 of which won. The city where I am in Montreal was the top prize winner, and I'll speak to how we've been involved in the implementation of that program now with a $50 million price tag. Okay, so I think when we look at what took place in the Sidewalk Labs kind of context, the Government of Canada, and we look at kind of international trends, just like kind of your organization and the work that you do internationally, there's a number of different networks that are also working with communities where we see openness as being kind of not necessarily repurposed, but kind of reframed in the context of smart cities. And the OGP would be a good example of that with the Open Government Partnership. And just had the opportunity to participate in the selection kind of committee for the new cohort of local communities that are now participating in their kind of revamped program. And it was a great way to be able to learn more about how openness translates into more accountability and transparency and inclusion in the design of communities as well. Okay, so when we talk about applying an openness lens to address complex local problems, well, let's be frank here. As somebody and as many organizations and stakeholders that are listening to this talk or to your event, we know very well that municipal leaders have no shortages of problems to deal with, especially in the context of a pandemic. So the key now is to starting from an issue kind of basis. What is the openness kind of opportunity here? How does openness help us frame and identify problems, as well as being able to rally different types of stakeholders to be able to address them? And we spend a lot of time at Open North working with communities, not to promote specific types of technological solutions, quite the contrary. We would consider ourselves to be technology agnostic. Our main focus is actually making sure that we have a better kind of understanding of the diagnostic of what the problem and the root causes of the problem itself are, and then starting from that basis, then looking at, you know, what data is available to be able to inform our understanding of that problem, which then eventually gets us to prototyping and kind of the innovation kind of cycle around that. So achieving openness outcomes then helps us, and I put this slide here because I think it's important to be able to demonstrate how a particular kind of new approach, when we talk about an openness kind of lens, also yields specific outcomes for decision makers and people who work within a municipal context. That's how you make the case about adopting an approach that might be, you know, that might require a different mindset, a different way of looking at kind of the world around you, and then kind of seeing that you know, you would be able to kind of eliminate certain silos, be more inclusive, having standardized practices, interoperability, which is obviously a, you know, a key for you know, folks that are listening in, people-centered approach. So all of those things, I think, is part of like building the case to be able to work with individual, you know, champions that have agency to kind of lead and demonstrate the value of openness, and then scale that more broadly within a given community. First starting with internal stakeholders, but also sometimes helping external stakeholders locally to be able to make the case to their decision makers as well. So really kind of leveraging different kind of democratic mechanisms to be able to have you know, better advocacy goals that also reflect the openness outcomes here. So some of the work that we do with communities is based on the work that we're doing that's funded by Infrastructure Canada through the Community Solutions Network. And this is really you know, one of the two teams at Open North that does this work. So we're, you know, we have one team that does an advisory service for open smart communities of all sizes, and we have another team that does research. And that's part of our integrated model, because for us to do good capacity building, we need to do good research. Once we do good capacity building, then we're able to also kind of connect communities together to kind of strengthen networks of a community of practice. And the Community Solutions Network is, and here you see some of the numbers and the targets that we've been able to reach over the last year. And this is really the kind of advisory service part of the work that we're involved in. And essentially what it is to give access to communities to different advisors that have a variety of different competencies, and to help them along the way through a learning journey that provides them access to a core curriculum that's offered online and whatnot. But the key here is that despite, you know, the size of the country, there are so many things and so many issues that communities have in common. And in many ways, I think it's about connecting those dots and connecting people together so that you're able to have a dialogue around those common issues and bringing the efficiency of scaling solutions and documenting those very well. And that's part of the work that we're doing at the advisory service. For us, you know, to step back a little bit, I think one of our key accomplishments, if I may, was the definition that we developed on an open smart city. As an open data activist, I've been doing this for, you know, 10, 12 years now on open data, co-founded a few initiatives on open data in Canada, the local level and provincial level. As we saw the discourse and the narrative around open data evolve and being confronted with issues that we weren't addressing as a community, you know, as directly as we could in our advocacy goals when we wanted communities to adopt an open data policy. I'm thinking of digital rights or some of the more kind of thornier, kind of like ethical issues around digital privacy. Those have reemerged, obviously, and we know very well, you know, why and how they've done that. But for us, we didn't want to use the definition of a smart city that's being adopted by, you know, the private sector, for example, because our values aren't there. Those aren't our values. So we decided that we would invest, you know, through funding from the Government of Canada in developing a new definition of an open smart city or an open smart community in order strategically to be able to create a field with a discourse that we would then be able to invite, local communities to recognize themselves into that vision of an alternative to a more corporate-centered and corporate-driven kind of agenda there. And you see the values are very, very kind of, very significant in that definition around fairness and ethical and transparent way, as well as balancing, a range of different types of interests from an economic, social, and of course, environmental kind of responsibility perspective. And just to say it, I think the part of the appeal of an open smart city is that it may not require a technological solution either. And that's part of kind of a recognition that I think we need to make and have a little bit more humility in the tech space to say, it's not about us in pushing out products and services. It's really about the residents and the local needs, themselves. And sometimes that requires a better engagement kind of strategy and being more inclusive in that design, and having, once we get past COVID, the ability to convene and having good kind of co-creation and participatory city, we would consider to be an open smart city as well. So I just want to make that point. So a few examples, that I'll get to, but I want to hone in a little bit more on the success factors of the City of Montreal and why it won the Smart Cities competition, partly because of what I just said. Because the proposal was not designed by public servants, within the halls of, their offices and, City Hall or whatnot. It was truly a co-creation event and co-creation process. And so the topics that emerge, whether it's on priorities on urban agriculture or mobility, or even regulatory experimentation, all of those things emerged because there was a demand for it. And I think this really kind of strikes, at the core of how we need to democratize democracy, and we need to democratize technology and democratize the way that we think and talk about data in our kind of local communities. At Open North, we have the ability, or we've been working with the City of Montreal, and part of our responsibility is the alignment of the variety of stakeholders that are in the different hubs on the topics that I've mentioned, to ensure that there's coherence and coordination on the data governance aspect of the challenge itself. So pulling together the different streams, but then also promoting best practices around interoperability and kind of normalization around that. By doing capacity building and whatnot. So there's a lot there that warrants probably more further exploration. We're in year 2 of 5 years. And so there's a lot more, that will come out. And we kind of feel like we're just getting started. It's such a big chantier. It's a big kind of, how do you say, kind of building kind of ground, to do something new. And the values of collaboration at the heart of the design of the proposal are really coming, through in the way that the partnerships are able to collaborate together. Here this obviously it will resonate with the work that your organization is doing, Martin, but the norms and agency in the smart cities, matter a lot. And when we talk about normalization, way past kind of open data, but who gets to set the terms by which we speak about technology? Who regulates? Those conversations are not always very accessible, especially for not-for-profit organizations and different types of stakeholders in the social sector, as well as other sectors that don't necessarily have the time or the ability or know how to participate. And so it's, we've taken it upon ourselves in a way to be able to participate in these conversations and working groups that are designed to, establish new regulatory frameworks on, ethical AI, for example, or procurement, and, a range of different types of issues. And what I would say is that when we participate in these meetings, one of the challenges is always about kind of representation. Who are we at Open North to make a claim to represent, all of Canadian civil society? Well, we don't, but we will try, and it puts the impetus on us to be able to consult within our network to be able to have a stronger voice that are, mainly dominated by kind of academia and private sector and whatnot. And I don't mean that I don't mean to, to focus too negatively on the private sector. I think, we collaborate with a number of different private sector companies and we have great relationships with them. But I think when we talk about the public interest and the public good from an open smart community perspective, norms, need to be developed in an inclusive way. Data governance, as I mentioned with Sidewalk Labs and the Keysight Project was a big, raised a lot of issues. We were asked by the City of Toronto 2 years ago now to help them think through some of the issues related to data governance to be able to inform their future planning. And part of their challenge when you look at a list like this is knowing how do you begin to start comparing different types of models of data governance across different sectors by using these different types of criteria, given the specificity of the context. It's very, very, very difficult to do. So like comparative analysis and like case studies that are able to do this effectively require so much knowledge to be able to get to that level of depth of understanding of the local context. So this is, to me, an opportunity for collaboration and then also perhaps normalization of the approaches by which we're able to document in different parts of the world, the experiences that we've had here. And we were able to produce a report where we documented, I believe it was 40 different data governance models, from which we extracted 20, and then from which we pulled out specific set of criteria to compare them. So according to different data governance models on privacy, for example, there might be some issues that were more relevant to the context of Toronto. So that's a resource here that's available that I'll gladly share with your audience. So going into more of the trends. So I think opening up tech procurement is a key one. There's a growing number of organizations that are quite focused on this. Not least the Open Contracting Partnership that I'm sure is familiar to some of your audience. And we've had the opportunity to work with them. We also work with organizations that don't necessarily focus on the tech side of procurement, but more on social procurement. So how to get social buy-in or social acceptability in the selection of different technological solutions as well. And I've listed here some of the reasons why, again, always from the perspective of making the case for opening up tech procurement, which is quite an opaque and inaccessible part of, the technology kind of conversation, but one that requires emphasis and an investment in developing our more literacy around understanding where and who and when decisions get made about specific pieces of technology. Again, from an agnostic perspective, but more from a process and design perspective. Number two, well, it's the priorities that are in prioritizing data governance. Oftentimes, when we talk about data governance, we tend to, people kind of want to talk about data management, and we kind of take a step back and we go, let's talk about data governance first, and let's talk about the structural and procedural, as well as relational aspects of the way that we're able to design effective data governance models. And each of those will have different repercussions in terms of inclusion and the type of not just the stakeholders, but the type of data also that are addressed in those three different pillars. And again, I won't go too much at length on this, but it's described in the report that we did with the City of Toronto. Entrenching digital rights. So of course, the city's coalition for digital rights, the Open Data Charter, as well as here the Montreal's Digital Data Charter, which is actually inspired and modeled on the city of Nantes in France. So a great partnership between Nantes and the city of Montreal. And what's interesting about a charter is and this wasn't the first charter that the city of Montreal had. Actually, the city of Montreal was one of the first cities in North America to adopt a charter of rights and responsibilities. So this is, almost tech, completely unrelated to technology and data, because it was adopted, I believe, in 2002. And one of the first gestures that we made as open data activists was to challenge one of the clauses in the Charter of Rights and Responsibilities of the city, to amend it and to ask that, not simply all pertinent information should be accessible by default, but that all open data, that particular raw data should be available in an open data format. So that was the kind of the introduction of open data from a rights-based perspective in the context of Montreal. And since then, fast forward 15 years, later, or 20 years later, then you've got the Montreal Digital Data Charter. The key here, obviously, is how do you implement a charter? Who is accountable and who's responsible for adhering to, in the case of Montreal, the 13 different principles that are there, and how do you go from a charter to a set of policies and directives, as well as impacting programming decisions, as well as your KPIs, and beyond the more kind of programmatic kind of aspect to it. How do you consult and how do you engage, in your accountability measures around those principles? So I do invite, folks that aren't familiar with the charter to visit the link that's here. And then lastly, and this is an example more from the context in the US, quite an interesting one. And I was looking for one in Canada, but I couldn't find one as good as this one. So I'm just going to go to the US for that. And it's in the city of Seattle. And it kind of goes to the issue that I was raising before around how do you activate those principles and who becomes accountable and responsible. And the city of Seattle created what they're calling the surveillance ordinance, which is by design really a step-by-step process to review how technology is deployed, and in particular AI technology. And we know obviously a lot of the issues related to biases that are being introduced in AI. But this is a good example of a mechanism that has kind of social buy-in from local residents that then shifts the culture of how we talk about data and how we make decisions. And ultimately, we need to be able to go from norms to these mechanisms and build up that accountability from an open, smart community perspective. So again, it's a good example to explore further. So at Open North, just as I wrap up, our advisory service works with communities. We've streamlined our process here. We're working with more than, I think, 20 different communities at the moment on a range of different topics, some of which I've mentioned here. So we're, obviously always interested in getting more communities, to work with us. This is a free service that we offer because it's funded by the Government of Canada, and we're going to be looking for opportunities to collaborate with partners internationally, as well as through with the advisors that we've recruited for this program. So thank you very much. I'll stop there and happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Jean-Noé. You have to imagine the loud clapping from the audience as we have this weird one-way situation. Thank you so much. I mean, there are so many elements. Of course, it's interesting. Also, what we do here now at the festival is we zoom in and see how the situation has been addressed locally, regionally in a country. So thanks for giving the insight from the Canadian perspective. Then also you talk interestingly about how to translate these learnings and in principles into practices, into also market mechanisms.
That's correct.
We had earlier, just wanted to make that bridge, we had earlier today a discussion on guides. Guides in the sense that, well, countries and regions are now producing their own guides because we need this translation between the global level. You mentioned standards, for instance, from ISO, IEC, ITU, and then to the local level. So the national or regional somehow has a role there in translating. So it's interesting to see these coming together. So my first question to you would be, I mean, you presented these links already. What do you see as the next step in consolidating then? Okay, so we have the guides, but but we also need systems that are, relevant for different societies, but still have the possibility to interoperate. So how can we get further on that path?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I think the focus on guides is one avenue. I think where we'd like to be able to go in the Canadian context is also getting to a point around certification. So I think recognizing leadership and recognizing things that are approaches that are abiding by different types of values. And when we talk about the open smart community, model that's emerging in the Montreal context versus the vision that took place in the Toronto context, how do we entrench that? How do we make sure that the wins that we get aren't susceptible to the buy-in of the political leaders at the time, and actually recognize those practices? And so certification goes, from a market kind of perspective, can apply on both sides of the equation, right? We'd like to be able to certify kind of best practices from an open smart city perspective, working with the communities that we're engaged with, as well as potentially incentivizing the private sector and product and service providers to also abide by a certain set of values in order to promote solutions that are actually, more in sync with the values that align with an open smart community. So I think, in a similar way that the environmental movement has done over, many years, from the light bulbs and LEED and like different types of like certification, there are rewards for adopting norms. And I think that's where we need to kind of amplify, those best practices, because oftentimes people are feeling like they're trying to do something that's entirely new because they believe that their context is that specific. And, I hate to break it to them sometimes. I'm like, actually, it's not that you're not special, but the problems are not only your own. And so there's more to win in adopting these principles that underpin open smart community.
Right. But in a way, when you talk about it, it's also as if a lot of this is not really new, is it? I mean, you mentioned, interoperability to shape markets. I mean, we've had this in previous centuries, right? So how big does the market need to be? That's one question. I mean, is Canada big enough to do this in a coherent and robust way? And the next question, if you answer no in some way, then how do you decide which parts are special for Canada and which parts are not, and make those decisions not set in stone, but something that you can following normal political deliberation can change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think from the market perspective, market size, I think what we're seeing, and you probably see this also in Europe because the density of just the geography and the proximity of communities. So Canada obviously is a very big country, but at the same time we're seeing an emerging trend around regionalism, and so it's more like regional markets, regional service and products providers. Also from an open smart community perspective, providing not necessarily a competitive advantage, but valuing local services and local products in the local economy as well. I mean so the market market solution, where we are now in 2021, it's not like there's a monopoly around kind of innovation that is only limited to the bigger players. Yes, of course, they have a competitive advantage in terms of the economy of the scale, that they operate in. But there's so much now that we've learned that we can actually, trust and rely on kind of local service providers as well. And the regionalism, I think, is a really interesting piece, from that interoperability perspective, because when we say interoperability, what we're also talking about is collaboration. And being able to connect people that, want to not only bring more efficiency in their choice of the technology, but actually win time, by selecting technologies that have been tested elsewhere and have the ability to understand how and what they learned from it as well. So I think there's great opportunities for growth. And I think, in the current context globally, I think we're seeing people kind of fall back into a more kind of localized economy approach. And that's certainly the case here.
Yeah, so they're from globalization to regionalization somehow. But interestingly, I mean, of course, so can you have even regional protectionism? Of course, that's one extreme. So if you want to have the benefit of global collaboration, global co-creation, global innovation, free trade, free exchange of knowledge and so on. I mean, there's a lot of balances to be found there, because I mean, we are seeing examples of deplatformization and deregulation playing quite, significant geopolitical roles now.
Absolutely. And I think federal kind of models are also kind of interesting context to be able to explore the relationship between different regions, under a federal kind of umbrella. So, there's different scales at which these companies are able to kind of operate. And for us, it's no surprise that we actually went from a very local kind of approach and then kind of leapfrog to a global approach, and then brought it back to the Canadian context, and then expanded into an inter-regional and national kind of purview through our work. And that was very, very strategic for us. And it was deliberate because we needed to be able to build our credibility. I think that's important in this space, and talk from experience and find those like 2-3 different cities where you really have the opportunity to demonstrate, and to do that proof of concept. And then kind of cities talk to each other. They look at each other and like, hey, they did this. Okay, well, why did they do that? They're very curious. So building networks in that way, I think, worked very well for us.
You sound almost like our Finnish colleagues who presented earlier on the Finnish collaboration. I believe that with 16 persons per square kilometer, Finland is the most sparsely populated country in Europe, and they usually say we are the Canada of Europe. So, and I mean, we had the colleagues from Tampere, and outside of Tampere is a small village called Nokia, where it all began. So what you say about having iterative cycles where sometimes you look very closely to home, if you will, and then you reach out. So it's not something static also.
Yeah, but just to that point, and I'm familiar with the Tempera kind of example in Finland, and I think it's about thinking about the vision of where you want to be, down the road, and by design, anticipating how you want to onboard and grow kind of your initiative as you start with that local effort, and creating those enabling conditions so that you don't make decisions from the get-go that will inhibit the ability to be able to yield the benefits of operating in the open. So that's where like collaborative data governance models, shared infrastructure, shared policies, from that interoperability perspective, but also shared investments and data sharing agreements, like all these things are happening in multiple localities around the world, and certainly in Canada too.
Yeah. So what is the role? I mean, the state, the federal, the local level on the demand side, if we say that on the market, what are the roles? I mean, you don't have to go into details, but I mean, are they doing their roles? How much can a city do? That's one question. And then, well, there's also a role on the supplier side, but then there's also this regulator role, which actually may sometimes be on both sides. Because cities have regulator, roles, and the state and the national, of course, has that. So, I mean, it's quite complex. A lot of people need to do things at the same time in the same direction with the same mindset. So, can one city just decide, yes, we will do it?
Well, yeah, it's a complex issue. Obviously, in the Canadian context, the cities are regulated by the provinces, and so a lot of their budgets come from the provinces, as well as taxes that they raise locally. So the challenge itself, the Smart Cities Challenge that I referred to, was a very kind of new completely new thing for the federal government to invest funding into kind of local communities through a Smart Cities Challenge. And the winners had to negotiate agreements with the provinces in order to have money reach the local communities themselves. So, that federalist model, different levels of government, in my mind, this is what has forced us to be able to talk more to each other. I'm always looking at kind of the silver lining, in these types of situations, but it does mean that from a regulatory perspective, it's very, very challenging to be able to know, what type of solution can be deployed, writ large, in different parts of the country because of different, maybe privacy requirements or different types of regulations as well. So the research and development piece, aspect of developing a new product and a service actually requires a significant investment to be able to do it well.
Right. Yes, and like the norms and the standards, if they can take away the sort of 90% of that hassle, or even just 10, that could be interesting. How much of you of this, and maybe Davor, if I don't want, if you want to join us, if we talk a little bit about the marketplaces for this, where do you actually find? So who's ready to deliver? Mm-hmm. I mean, one thing is about the R&D and the testing and pilots and so on. But at some point, I mean, electric grids, they grew out from trying out stuff to being, the backbone of our lives. And so the internet have grown the same way. So hello, Davor. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Jean-Noe.
So
hi, Martin.
This needs to grow into a real market, right? So maybe Jean-Noe, you can share some reflections. Maybe Davor, you want to chip in as well?
Yeah. So from our perspective, I think what we see is that, like you say, I think we all feel that the field is in motion. It's kind of reaching a new maturity stage. I think on a number of fronts. The hype cycle is at its at a certain point. What it comes down to, I think, is a number of things. It's about moving from best practice to stuff you can do and implement, stuff that works, and sharing that. I think what you kind of need to have is as an ambition on a local level. There's this quote. It's by a medieval poet called Rumi out of Persia, and he says, "We're not drops in the ocean. We're all the mighty ocean in a drop." Right. So I think that's what you need to go to. You need to kind of have that universal knowledge, best practice capability on a local level, and that means you need to have a whole kind of time of sharing and learning kind of collectively in order to reach these goals, because everybody's looking at the local level as the level where it happens, but then that's just not enough, because I think the problems are global. And so for that you need honest kind of ways of looking at, okay, what works where, and would that work with me, what do I need, and so forth. So what we've been doing with OASC is try to create some model. It's an initial thing, so we're looking, we're still shaping it. But what we try to do is look at how federating data about what cities are up to and what they're deploying and things like that, how that can work as a model where it's just where you make sure that the governance of whatever the information is with the cities, so that basically the profile and the solutions and the stuff they've done, that's controlled by the city. And then you kind of, laterally involve the different stakeholders to that. So that creates a platform where a city can see what another city has done and has some degree of, reliability in terms of, the information there. Also, what you need to look at is how to then link that, and that's what I heard you say, Jean-Noe, is to what's the impact you can expect once you deploy something like that. That's a real tough cookie. I don't think anybody has that level of knowledge, and I don't think it's like a build it first and then we'll see type of thing. I think it's a very agile way in which you need to approach this. For now, we're just linking it to kind of impact objectives that kind of correspond to the SDGs or urban challenges. We're working with the city by city catalog. It works with it federates with the ICC marketplace. We're looking to kind of also use that for our own network, which is a bit more techie, focused on the interoperability and so forth. And some other conversations with national levels are also ongoing. So it's something we're exploring. We're kind of building and seeing, and we have a service designer, John Lynch, if he's awake. Hi, John. He's been helping us kind of talk to everybody, and somehow we're still launching stuff and finding out. But we're really keen to work with you guys. We as you know, we like Open North a lot. I think a lot of the stuff you guys do is just phenomenal. So if that's something that you are kind of looking at, and I do remember somewhere that I presented these ideas to a team from Open North more than a year ago. So I think, and I remember there was a big interest then, just on kind of where we were. We kind of bounced the ideas off. So if that's something we can kind of do together in 2021, I'll be all for that. Yeah.
Well, thank you. And I mean, I think what resonates with me with what you're saying is also how organizations and not-for-profit organizations specifically in this space have a particular role to play in the tech ecosystem. And there's new skills and capacities that we've had to develop because we've situated ourselves as that kind of honest broker, having to develop kind of new kind of negotiation skills, essentially building trust between people, between different types of stakeholders, to have an honest discussion about, perceived and real risks related to technology, and kind of really kind of banking on the ability to not have a vested interest because, we're driven by different motives as a not-for-profit organization. And I would say that's actually a positionality that is not only appealing to the communities that we're working with, because they can just kind of talk about their real problems, without expecting that we're there to sell them something. Of course, we want to work with them on a project basis, but you understand what I mean. But it's also through the emergence of these different skills, also connecting to the private sector itself, because they see and they recognize organizations like ours, that have those relationships. And we all know that it goes through relationships and the trust that exists within it. And so the private sector is now kind of asking us to engage with, their clients, to be able to have and host different conversations that they're not able to have themselves. So to me, this is a win-win kind of win-win-win situation between the private sector, the government, and the social sector as well. But it's not something that I would take for granted. And I think there's a lot to learn, from having evolved as an organization that positions itself as, a trust kind of broker between different parties on technology related issues. And that's something that we could scale kind of internationally. And, and I know for sure that, the opportunities that we've had aren't unique to Open North. And I think that's reflective of kind of the pressures that, government leaders are facing right now.
Right, and I mean, you said at some point, so who are we to represent the cities and the citizens, right? I mean, you were not elected, and it's not like we don't have municipal associations. It's not like we don't have networks of fantastic networks of cities that are global region oriented, or I mean, we have like of course eClay on the sustainability side. We have the resilient cities. We have tons of other networks that we work with, but maybe also these specific technical interoperability issues are new. So they have not they have not since decades for cities like Tampere, who were, very embedded to thinking about this. They were not, there was not capacity and people hired and money set aside from the city's side to do these things, to drive standards. They just came, as you said, with industry. So perhaps it's also, quite normal, quite logical that it takes a little bit of time, and now maybe there's space for some new network organizations to take that role, but then understanding what is the mandate, what is the
legitimacy.
Legitimacy is for sure, the power relationships certainly. So who decides if you're the honest broker? Who certifies the certifier?
That's it, because there's an opportunism that I'm describing here, which is, okay, people want to talk about this, so sure, we'll show up and, we've got advice and we'll be able to kind of document it. But then it's it really kind of falls back to kind of democratic kind of principles, and that's where kind of democratizing technology becomes very important. And to your point about climate change and other kind of big topics and communities of practices, that have been focused on these issues for a long time, I think what we're seeing from our perspective is, and I'm probably seeing that too, is like data governance for what? Data governance to tackle climate change, data governance to fight COVID, data governance, fill in the blank, and that's what we've had to do our own thinking about. What is our data governance model? What are the enabling conditions to do that before we can kind of step into those kind of issue-based kind of communities of practices? But we're there now, and there's huge opportunities for that.
Okay, so maybe we're approaching the top of the hour. We should get ready to move a little bit south. So we will have a session coming up now with US and colleagues from Colombia, Medellin, Ruta N, and so on. So I don't know, Jean-Noé, do you have some closing words you want to leave with us, with the audience? I mean, naturally, we are very sad we could not sit in the same room, but on the other hand, we have the opportunity to, in a way, embrace the world in our conversation here. So any final words there?
Well, I'll just say thank you, honestly, just to have the opportunity to start the year by connecting with colleagues, across the Atlantic is always nice. And I think we need to kind of remember the values, that really kind of like bring us together. I think that's really the strength, that we need to kind of focus in as we kind of face, problems that are becoming more and more and more complex, right? And so it really kind of goes through that values-based approach and really kind of situating the public interest in the work that we do. So thank you for the opportunity.
Wise final words. So back to you, Davor, and to